Welcome to Weird Web Radio, an explorer's guide to hidden worlds of the paranormal and occult, reality-expanding experiences, and the downright weird and bizarre. With your host, Lonnie Scott.
Hey gang, welcome to another episode of Weird Web Radio. I'm your host, Lonnie Scott. Thank you for taking time out of your day to be here. Today's episode features Darragh Mason Field, and Darragh is an award-winning photographer and researcher who studied photography at Dublin City University, traveled all over Asia, Europe, America, writing articles, publishing photography. He's been in post-war countries doing his work, and he's best known for the work on his photography of the Aghori Hindu sect and work surrounding the Djinn. This is a fascinating episode. At least it was for me. It was really cool to interview him. You want to talk about going into some dark and macabre places and getting to know some people who are really challenging the status quo and the caste system of India and their country in ways that can't simply be ignored or pushed aside. Wow. And then we get into possession and things that are concerning the Djinn, and that really taught me a lot and cleared up any misconceptions I think a lot of people might have concerning the Djinn and the word. He also has a podcast I think you guys should check out on folklore and magic, and it is called The Spirit Box. It's available on his YouTube channel and got all kinds of cool content, and his website. You can go find, more of his work and see some of his photography. Follow him on Instagram. That's how I found him. I'm kind of rambling, so as always, if you want to hear the bonus portion of this episode, you go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio or weirdwebradio.com and click join the membership, and you'll be taken straight into that membership, gain access to all of the archives of all the extended interview bonus audio. I hope you all are staying safe and healthy out there and doing the best you can to maintain all your sanity during these crazy times with the quarantine and the mandatory shelter-in-place orders that are varied from state to state across the United States and all over the world. It's my wish that you all come out of this healthy and better for all the time that we spent. So, without any further ado, just sit back, relax, and enjoy this show. Stay weird out there, my friends. And we are recording. Darragh Mason Field, welcome to Weird Web Radio. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Yeah, it's before we got started recording, I made that quick little joke, I love getting started on these sort of unplanned conversations. There's only been a couple times, maybe a few in the history of my show. I'm in my fourth year doing this now, where I sort of intentionally and non-intentionally went after someone I heard on another show very, very recently. So in your case, you were just recently on Rune Soup with Gordon White and talking about your photography and things. I went searching you out on Instagram because I thought this guy's got to have some of the coolest pictures in the world. And then the conversation began, and here we are. How cool is that?
Yeah, awesome. I'm very grateful you hunted me down.
Yeah, I am too. I'm glad we started that conversation. And I'll tell you, for you, I'm not sure how many people know who you are based on, Rune Soup and other things. Thankfully, Gordon did that show with you and brought you to my awareness. And I hopefully am doing the same with my audience to bring you into their awareness, because I think the things that you talk about are things that we don't normally get into. But before we get too far, it is the talking about photography that got us, on this track. All right. I was reading in your bio, and it says, where did that go? That you are best known for your work, and I don't think I'll pronounce this right, but I'll try, the Aghori Hindu sect and work surrounding the Djinn.
That's right, yes.
Okay. I am going to confess to just damn near complete ignorance on what the Aghori Hindu sect is, and I really don't know a whole lot about the Djinn. So why would your photography take you into that realm?
Well, I started to love with India, looking back a long time ago. Really, there was a play on Channel 4 in the UK and Ireland called Macabre, and that really started kind of my interest in Indian history, um, the rich literary history that goes back thousands of years. And that was always in the back of my head. And I kind of read a lot of travel logs about India, particularly a chap called William Dalrymple. And he introduced me through his book Nine Lives to what the Aghori are. And the Aghori are pretty much a left-hand path Hindu sect. I did a lot more research into it, as it struck me there would be really striking visual images. But the Aghori essentially are a sect that they do everything that a traditional Hindu person or practitioner would find abhorrent. So, and they do this to really show that there's no difference between what you would see as something pure and beautiful and something kind of horrible and corrupt. They're basically saying both things are they're manifestations of creation. They both lead to the same place, essentially. And they call this concept non-discrimination. So I sort of got a lot more interested in what they were doing, because that practice of non-discrimination meant doing things like meditating in the ashes of cremation pyres. Indeed, actually sleeping, or there's a ritual called Shavasadhana, which literally translates as corpse magic. And that involves sleeping and meditating on top of a corpse. So it's, through a Western viewpoint, we'd call that necromancy. And that's pretty much what it is. So I went to Varanasi, which is the holiest city in India, and on the banks of the Ganges. And whenever you see those kind of National Geographic shots of bodies burning on the banks of the Ganges, that's Varanasi. That's that city, and it's ancient. It goes right back into antiquity. I think it's the oldest inhabited city in the world, I think, from memory. So I spent some time in Varanasi tracking the Aghori down, because their main ashram, or like their kind of temple complex, it's called Kina Ram Ashram. I've named after Kina Baba Ram, who's the founder of the Aghori. But they kind of trace their lineage right back to Shiva. That's what they say. And you'd see Aghoris occasionally walking around, and they'll be the ones holding kampalas, which are skull cups. And the ritual I photographed was an Aghori sadhu drinking a pint of whiskey out of a human skull. And it was quite hard to find, but eventually I managed to track them down, because a lot of them had started to go to Kumbh Mela, which is the largest gathering of I think it's the largest gathering of people in the world, where every sadhu in India goes to Allahabad and it goes to bathe in the river there. So it's that event in itself is remarkable. You get kind of all the kind of the thousands of arrays of aesthetics and sadhus make their way there and kind of en masse run into the river. But the Aghori, as I said, kind of their practices, what they do is absolutely seen as abhorrent to Hindus. They're known to practice cannibalism, consume their own waste. The ritual that I witnessed was the consuming of alcohol, as I said, out of the skull. And that very much would be a taboo thing. And Hindus don't really drink alcohol, and it's banned in a lot of states.
That's that's quite an interesting sect. I can see how that would fly in the face of a lot of Western traditions for sure, and I'm certain some of the Hindu sections. And you describe them as practicing a left-hand path, and I think some listeners will have a Western view of left-hand path. They might think Satanism or Setian kind of things. More popular ideas of left-hand path here. I'm not so sure that that's exactly what left-hand path means there.
Probably not. I mean, they kind of reminds me of the book like Lieber Nolan's Psychonaut by J.P.
Mm-hmm.
Carroll, and in that book, I think it's in the Lieber Knox section, he talks about an exercise of adopting different characteristics. So going and say having a different political viewpoint to your own natural one, doing that for 6 months, or going and taking up a hobby that you find absolutely absurd and doing that for a year. And the point of those kind of exercises is to deprogram you from what you think you are, what you think are the characteristics that make up Darragh or that make up Lonnie, and that to start to understand that these are malleable. They're not as kind of concrete as you would originally think and assume, and that actually you can change what you think you believe. Which I think probably it falls somewhat into your work as a hypnotist, getting into kind of that territory. And these exercises that the Aghori practice are very much of the same view. They're like to shock you out of your traditional views of what reality is, and that if you can carry out an act that somebody would see as abhorrent and kind of realize you're still there, and you start. The idea is that you don't see the difference between a pile of gold or a pile of dog food. You don't see the difference. They're all manifestations from the same source, and they're all paths back to the same source, if that makes sense.
Oh, it makes perfect sense. Lieber Nolan Psychonaut is one of the most foundational things in who I became today.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. So, I mean, you were talking about that exercise of basically paradigm shifting, changing how you relate to the world around you.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've done some of those exercises yourself. What do you find? I guess for you, if you've done those, what did you find the most challenging about doing things like that?
Well, I mean, I think sometimes it's subtle stuff. So it's stuff where I wouldn't feel comfortable. I wouldn't feel comfortable in the sense of like I'm in danger. Sometimes that kind of thing doesn't bother me as much. Like some of the places I photographed, some of the things I photographed, a lot of people would find really tough. So like I've shot part of like tracking down the Aghori, took me through a leprosy ward, and I photographed the patients there, obviously with their consent. And I've photographed things like the dissection of a human brain, that kind of thing. But so those things don't really throw me. I feel very much just curious about them. Not reckless, but curious. Things that I found really challenging to do would be to do stuff like, and I did this practice one time of going and dancing a thing called this thing called the 5 rhythms. I don't know if that's in the UK, where you got to kind of dance through emotions and dance through colors. And that to me was absolutely awful. It was it's just not in my makeup. But I forced myself to do it, and almost immediately afterwards I met my partner. So it was a magical act of putting myself through an excruciating experience. Having someone kind of tell me to dance through red is not in my makeup.
Yeah, that's something I'm going to have to look up. I've never heard of dancing through colors like that.
Yeah, if I remember, it's like dancing through like emotions and colors. It's very kind of lovely hippies, very nice people. But, there's something I struggled with.
Yeah, I like that. Struggle dancing with hippies through your emotions. But yeah, if you want to hang out in a leprosy ward and find people sleeping on corpses, game on.
I'm totally cool with that bit,
yeah. So you head to India and you're going to go find this Aghori sect. I can't imagine they have a sign hanging out like Starbucks. That's got to be kind of an adventure unto itself, I would think. How do you even begin looking for these people and then get their permission to photograph something they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, and the language barrier is a big thing. So one of the basic things that you have to get somebody on the ground, someone who speaks English well enough to understand the subtlety of what you're trying to achieve, and can represent you really well. And in India is a really multilingual country. People speak fantastic English there. It's relatively it can be relatively straightforward. It's just finding the right person is the tricky bit. And usually there's lots of tour guides there, all over the place. You'll find tour guides kind of anywhere. So I'd start talking to those guys, give them a sense of what I was trying to achieve, and get either a local fixer, or get a tour guide with good enough English that I can communicate to him, because his English will be a hell of a lot better than my Hindi, that's for sure. But that was it, really. I found a tour guide, and I was able to take him through what I was looking for, talk about kind of the Aghori, Sadhu, and kind of, sign out and kind of illustrate what I was trying to achieve. And off we went looking for them. And then we found a small temple of a guy called Shri Baba Chamundaram. And this is it. When you look at my photographs on the Aghori, you'll see a shelf with 3 skulls on it, and that's his temple, his ashram. Incidentally, though, I found out something afterwards after shooting this place. Because it took me about 5 days to a week to track them down. Because we found it, to find that place. The first Aghori I found, it took me about 3 days to find, because a lot of them had gone to Allahabad, as I mentioned earlier. But that particular place with the 3 skulls on the shelf, there was also kind of a couple of skull caps lying around. Like he was working on a book of mantras, just endlessly repeating mantras in this large book that he was copying into it, and then resting on top of the book was just a little skull cap, and he had just like Bombay mix. He was just eating Bombay mix out of it as he was writing. So skulls on a shelf, little shrines to, a whole plethora of gods and goddesses on the walls. It was like Durga, Shiva, Kali, and of course there was a commemorative picture on the wall of Baba Keenaram, the Aghori founder. And my fixer explained what he wanted to do, and he said, "Fine, go and get me a bottle of whiskey." After some negotiation, and I went off, got a bottle of whiskey, came back at the appropriate time, and we did the ritual.
That's quite a scene to walk into.
Yeah, it is. It's like a miniature temple of Djinn. It really is. But one interesting thing was with the skulls, if I remember correctly, there was the 3 skulls on the wall, the skull rack. So they had a 2 dots of color on the forehead. Let me just see if I can recall exactly what the sequence of colors was. It was, they had large yellow saffron dot, and then a red dot in the middle. But they also had kind of 3 lines, 3 kind of Shiva lines across the forehead, and they were just in old wreaths of flowers just lying there on them. Then my fixer saw this, and he kind of whispered in my ear, and he's like, "That's bad. That's not good." And I didn't really know what he meant, to be honest. I was like, "Yeah, okay." He sees 3 skulls. Most people's response to skulls are that's not great,
Right.
But I did a talk on the Aghori and presented this gallery of work in a cult bookshop of renown in London called Treadwell's, and it's generally the kind of broad audience to Treadwell's is mostly occult practitioners, but a lot of them tend to be very, very well very well educated in the occult, and can tend to be PhDs in kind of relevant topics. And afterwards, when I kind of mentioned that that particular story, my fixer didn't tell me why. He's just like, that's bad. One of the attendees was able to explain to me that the mixture of the two colors together, the significance of that was it was trapping the prana, the essence of the person who once inhabited that skull in the skull. So it's trapping a spirit to whatever magical purpose that the society wants to use it for. So that's essentially what those are.
Yeah, I could see where someone would think that was bad.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Where do they get the skulls and the corpses that they meditate upon? Are you aware where they source these materials?
Yeah. I mean, they're everywhere. I mean, you can walk down to the Ganges and you can see human arms floating in the river. Like, it's at any given time there's funeral pyres, and on the main burning ghats there's funeral pyres going, like 20 of them going continuously. So there's several different ghats, several different burning ghats. There's the principal one, which is like the holiest place to get cremated in India. And then there's another one which is kind of for unnatural death, which is things like suicides, car accidents, that kind of thing. And then there's an electric one, which is just a kind of tradition, like what we would see as a crematorium. It's called the electric one in Varanasi by the locals. And it's kind of a morbid joke about it, or observation rather, which is my fixer was mapping out to me, is that these main cremation grounds, he says smell, there's no smell. And that's true, there wasn't any smell. When you get near the crematorium and you get that kind of quite distinct smell, and I'm not afraid to say, quite porkish smell of human bodies burning.
Yeah, I can imagine that smell would be one of the first things you discover coming upon places like that, for sure.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is painting quite a picture of parts of India I don't think a lot of people are even aware exists.
Well, in every major, like particularly Hindu city, you have cremation grounds. They'll be by the rivers, and basically someone gets burnt. The ashes are then kind of spread into the river. But there's things like, and like you kind of learn this weird stuff as you kind of attend these areas, is that things like women's hip bones don't burn particularly well. They tend to need more heat to break down, and it's the same with men's chests, bones. But they'll kind of take these bones out with rakes, and they'll kind of shake them off and row out into the river and dump the bits of bodies in. But yeah, you would. That's where they get the skulls. They're down by the riverside. And I don't want to paint a picture like that you're tripping over them, because you're not. but they are there. So if you want to get a human skull in Varanasi, that would not be difficult.
It doesn't sound like it'd be very difficult. Wow.
Cool.
Yeah. So another part of this whole journey and the question concerns the Djinn.
Yes.
And I'd be willing to bet a lot of money that a lot of people hear the word Djinn, especially in the West, and at worst their concept is Aladdin.
Yeah.
And at best they might have an idea of something tied to maybe similar to fairies. Mm-hmm. Let's clear up some of that. Let's begin. What exactly are the Djinn?
So within Islam, there's Allah created three at the beginning, created three species of sentient life. He created the angels out of light, Djinn out of smokeless fire, and he created humans out of sounding clay. So the difference is that angels had no free will. The Djinn did, and human beings did as well. But Allah commanded everyone, the Djinn and the angels, to kind of bow down to Adam. And the Djinn were nonplussed by this, and essentially that's the kind of start of the division. So Iblis, who's seen as the Islamic Satan, said he would not bow down, and because he's better than human beings. and it all kicked off. So it's similar to kind of like the war in heaven in Christian mythology and the fall, um, and this is where the kind of the origin myth of the jinn within Islam comes from. But most likely, when you hear about jinn, they're referring to deities that predate Islam. So characters like Lilith, like Pazuzu, that kind of character. But they have a vast and populous array of jinn, of types of jinn. Some of them are like hyper local, down to kind of specific areas of river have a specific jinn in them. But fundamentally, they're believed to be invisible, but they're also believed to be very similar as human beings. So they also eat, they drink, they sleep, they have families, and there's also there's the inference that jinn and human beings can have children together, that it's possible, but it seems obviously pretty a despicable thing to do. So they're like within Islamic thought, they think of it like they have a subtle body, so that they're the whole idea of their smokeless fire gives them a kind of an array of special supernatural powers, so they can change their shape, they can fly, they can enter human bodies. They've been associated with epilepsy and illness, and then within there's the practice of sihir, which is to try and make them magical allies, and to tell human beings knowledge from I'm pronouncing it correctly, Al Gayab, which is the kind of the unseen world. So they're complex characters, that they are very similar to fairies in terms of relationship to landscape, relationship to previous cultures, previous religions. And they also kind of have similar thing to demons. Whereas nobody's really generally afraid of fairies, obviously because they know nothing properly about them. That's the main reason they're not afraid. They have the kind of Disney version of it, whereas kind of trepidation and fear of the jinn is a very much living thing within Islam. London's obviously a very multicultural city, and in areas I've worked with in London, where I have had Muslim colleagues, and I kind of start to talk about the jinn. First off, I get the kind of like, how the hell do you know about them? Why you asking me about them?
Yeah, like who told you?
Exactly, yeah. And kind of there's trepidation there, and then eventually the stories come. It's like my brother was renovating this house, and you can hear them, and there's that whole thing of like, and this is a real thing, it is a real belief. And certainly the areas that I shot in India in relation to the jinn, I found people doing quite protracted petitioning and devotionals to the jinn to get them to intercede on their behalf, and photographed people who'd been, or areas where people were being possessed by the jinn and being brought by their families to get help in a sacred shrine, in a couple of sacred shrines in Delhi. So it's everywhere, and certainly, yeah, the belief in the jinn is absolute in the Islamic world.
Now, how does, I guess culturally, how is it decided that someone is possessed by the jinn?
Well, there's a couple of factors. So there's quite a few different layers to this. So just as in Christianity, you've got the idea of oppression, where you're not possessed, but you are under the influence, or you're being intruded on by a demoniac. Where in Islam, it's the same thing. The term is called waswaza, waswaz or waswaza, depending on the region, and that essentially is the whispering of demons. That's what it translates as. It's kind of like the whispering of devils, rather. And that's particularly associated with. Let me think. There's a particular type of jinn that it's associated with. It's either ifrit or marid, and their kind of role is to kind of be a whispering one to lead you off the path of towards God. Yeah, I can't remember exactly which one, but it's totally associated with. But that is a term. Was is a term. And when they describe the symptoms of was, and indeed a lot of the symptoms of oppression, they read like a kind of just a tick box of mental health issues. They talk about repetitive action, not being able to keep your mind still to pray, intrusive thoughts, like any kind of what we would say kind of obsessive compulsive condition, that kind of thing. So that they read like very much a standard list of what you would expect to be mental health issues, and this is a question that I raised with a hereditary caretaker of a Sufi shrine in Delhi's Ridge Forest, a little place called Khawaja Muddin Shiki, which is named after a Sufi saint. The village was there for 150 years ago. And there's a little shrine that remains there. Because I asked him that question, how do you know if somebody's possessed by Djinn or have a mental health problem? And he was very forthcoming with this. He didn't kind of shy away from it. And what he described was there's a couple of conditions. He said it's not just Djinn, it's also evil spirits, which we're seeing in a separate category. And how he described it was when he encountered somebody, there was a test, which was there's an iron chain hanging outside this shrine. There's two things there. So an individual will have to hold the iron chain. So Djinn have a terrible aversion to iron and steel, which again, incidentally, fairies have an aversion to iron as well. So that's the first sign. And then the second one is be able to pass the threshold into a sacred place, which is the Sufi shrine. Then he would employ a method of meditation where he would come upon, he would call upon rather the soul of what his ancestor, the Sufi in the tomb, to give him a sign. And he described this as, if I get a green flag, then this person doesn't have Djinn or a spirit in them. It's a mental health issue. And then he was quite matter of fact that case I would then refer them to go to seek medical attention from an appropriate place. I said, but if I get a red flag, I said that's when it's intrusion. That's when it's something else they're hooked into an individual. And at that point, they commence exorcism, and that would involve saying of prayers and hadiths and passages from the Quran, a dua rather, instead of prayers and passages from the Quran and hadiths over the individual, and that can go on for months. Yeah, you really can.
Months.
Yeah, to get someone clear of that kind of possession.
So if they're going through the exorcism, they come like it's an appointment. Do they go on about their lives and just, it's about 5 o'clock, I gotta go for my exorcism, I'll be back for dinner.
No, I'm late. It's they would come back on specific days, or their family would bring them back. Sometimes there was areas where there were kind of enclosures where people would sit there waiting to be seen. But yeah, if their families would bring them back every week.
Yeah.
Really, yeah.
I asked some of my fans, like I do usually before a guest comes on, if they had any questions, and I told them a little bit about you, what I learned from Rune Soup. And one question came back to me about the Djinn. I'm not sure you'll be familiar with this, but it's worth a shot, right? Mm-hmm. Kat Heath, who's a good friend of mine, she's also an author. She wanted to ask, what's your take on the late Rosemary Ellen
Guiding.
Gillies? Yeah, theories on Djinn and various forms of paranormal phenomena such as shadow people.
I think there's probably something to it. Yeah, I think a lot of these things. Well, I mean, John Keel was in the same territory, and Jacques Vallée is in the same territory when they talk about the idea of we're interacting with something, but we don't really know what it is, but it seems to change face all the time, and present a different image of itself to us. The thing I think about Djinn is, I think the important thing to remember is a real catch-all term, just as fairy is. It's a real catch-all term. Um, and the different, like when you go and look at the kind of talk about the different types of Djinn, and how they've been categorized in that human way, as we love to do, is like it's this. First off, you've got the zoomorphic manifestation. So a black dog is particularly associated with Djinn, but they can also be scorpions, cats, owls, kind of a Arabic donkey thing called an onager. So they're associated with a kind of a set of animals, but like there's the usual suspects in there. Owls turn up in kind of any, quite a lot in magical or supernatural events. There's also kind of anthropomorphic manifestations. So they're kind of they'll be kind of a human form. They kind of lack individuality, but they gain individuality by materializing in human forms. So like they're kind of just a partly animal, not fully human, and they're kind of depicted as being fairly monstrous. Well, one of the things that's quite interesting kind of goes back to the whole idea of like Rosemary, Aghori was saying about shadow people and the connection is that there's Djinn in the form of mists or winds or shadows. And so there's a guy called, here comes my Arabic pronunciation, so my apologies in advance. But Zubair ibn al-Awam, and so he was said to have accompanied Muhammad during his lecture to the Djinn. And his view of the Djinn was they're shadowy ghosts with no individual structure. So there's a lot there to say that Djinn appear as like shadows on the wall. It's certainly not wrong. There's lots of references and descriptions of types of Djinn appearing as that, appearing as forms of storms and shadows instead to travel on the wind. Which again is like the more I looked into this and started looking at kind of like my own folkloric history in Ireland, that we've seen that the Djinn been associated with the wind and traveling in the wind, and indeed they said kind of when they talk about being smokeless fire, they're said to be formed from originally the sun and wind. The scorching desert wind is what the protein that they were fashioned from by Allah. And there's an expression in Irish which is my Irish pronunciation is no better than my Arabic, in fairness, but it's Djinn Nashi, which is basically wind of the fairies. And so fairies were also known to travel as a wind, and if that wind touched you, that in like touched kind of Irish peasants, they would be like, well, that's it, my number's up, I've been touched by the fairy wind, so I'm not long for the world. So again, similarities in there. So these things are catch-all terms. There's definitely kind of a whole plethora of life in there. So I think there's definitely something to
it. It's obvious that your photography and interests, combine pretty well, taking you on these more occult-leaning adventures.
Mm-hmm.
For one, that's awesome. You're clearly taking yourself to some very interesting places. How, I guess, are people working with Djinn magically? Are they trying to make allies out of them? Just the same way people try to work with fairies and demons and everything else.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, totally. I mean, it's deeply, deeply forbidden in Islam. you know, like it's like it's hugely frowned upon. But I mean, I've had to change my my YouTube channel. I've had to add a caveat to my YouTube channel and to my contact form on my website, basically saying I don't practice Djinn magic. Please don't. I don't offer these services. So I get regularly contacted by people trying to, um, get a loved one back or try and make contact with a family member who's deceased. Um, and I don't offer those services. But they, those things exist. People have those local services and people who do that kind of thing. Um, and I've never yet been contacted to go, can you help me with a Djinn intrusion? It's always to kind of, can you help me intercede with the Djinn and petition him to help me, which is quite an interesting thing.
Yeah.
It says a lot about the perception of it that I've never been asked for help. Help me get my boyfriend back. That's what comes up, and they are, if you do a lot of search into kind of rukia, where people look for help with the evil eye and that kind of thing to get curses removed. It's a lot of it's that stuff, help win back your partner. And you get that with a lot of you get a lot of kind of magical services like that are kind of almost like the TV ads you see for kind of like slightly rubbish tarot readers. You see those. And when you're kind of a practitioner, you cringe when you see those TV ads.
Mm-hmm.
That's not everything that we do, but there's lots of stuff like that of lots of websites for that. We even buy talismans, protection from the evil eye, and get your partner back, all that kind of stuff. And it's in that kind of broad magical territory. But there's two different types. There's kind of like there's a forbidden magic, and then there's kind of a more kosher magic, which is like the protection stuff and getting rid of Djinn intrusion. And obviously the forbidden stuff is working with Djinn as allies.
It's amazing to me too how people always seek out more universal approaches to spirit and things. How universal it seems, even into the ancient world, how that love kind of magic was. I always think of the Greeks with their curse tablets, like,
yeah.
cause them horrible nightmares and blind their eyes until they come back to me, or just terrible stuff.
And there's so much of it. There's just so much of it. Like when you look at like the Greek magical papyri, it's full of it. Absolutely full of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So something you said to me in our private messages, our conversation, was the focus of my work over the last 2 to 3 years has been the nature of spirits and our engagement with them, from possession, paranormal experiences, through to petitioning of spirits themselves. Mm-hmm. So I'm guessing in part the photography is one aspect of that.
Yeah.
How much of this are you practicing yourself? Are you on your own seeking engagement in magical ways with spirit?
So I have my own practice, and I have kind of my own pantheon that I pray to and kind of petition. But I do. I'm very new on my my proper magical journey, or journey of kind of expanding that element of my spiritual beliefs. Since I was 15, I've been like using divination and meditation and all that kind of stuff. Then you add together to form a proper magical practice, but with none of the discipline and none of the instruction. So that's changing now. I mean, kind of the broad framework that I would work in would be Thelema, but kind of folk magic forms a big part of my practice. So that's I've got kind of a natural fondness and inclination towards the well, some people think it's this, simplistic folk magic, but for me, I absolutely love it. I prefer that an awful lot more to the correspondences of like Liber 777. I would be very much a fan of the American equivalents of hoodoo and root work, and that's really the practice. And in the Irish tradition of pishogues, of kind of like spellcraft, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I like that kind of that stuff. I definitely get drawn to.
Yeah, I'll never miss a chance to recommend someone get Six Ways by Aidan Wachter. If, believe me, I think you'll really enjoy it.
I'll take a note of that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, since you said you have your own sort of pantheon, I didn't know if something like that would come up. Another listener question was from someone named Samantha. She's actually a supporter of the show. Thank you, Samantha, for being out there. She says, I'm curious about the nature of gods versus non-god spirits and what he might think about that. You got any thoughts on that subject?
Does she mean the nature of the gods in terms of like good versus evil, or?
I think when people are asking questions like that, like I gave her my own answer saying, that I think all spirits are sort of this range of diverse power and influence. And some end up getting god titles at different times throughout history and thrown together at occasion and called a pantheon because we could do that looking back. I'm not so sure that historically cultures would recognize it that way. But yeah, it is a subject that comes up an awful lot. People wondering how others see the gods in their nature.
Yeah, I mean, I think your answer is pretty good, to be honest. That would be kind of how I would see it too. I mean, like, I was born into a Catholic family, like Catholic on the surface family, and like saints are a massive thing. They're a huge thing in Catholicism. There's a specific saint that you might go like, I have this saint that I'm attached to. So you have like the overarching Holy Trinity, and you have the higher kind of God form of God. But beneath that, you have all these saints. You have the secondary gods of like, you've got Virgin Mary, you've got Jesus, you've got the Holy Spirit, and then you've got archangels, and you've got saints. So like we just move the titles around really, because we pray to saints all the time. And for a monotheistic religion, it's a huge contradiction. So it's like we would continually pray to saints to intercede on our behalf, and they'll have specialisms. They'll be, the Saint Jude for hopeless causes or lost causes, and Saint Christopher, patron saint of travelers. For example, for me, like two people or two entities that sit on my altar are Saint Christopher and Hermes. Well, they're essentially two expressions of the same force. They're kind of like gods of travelers, of guides, of borders, of exchange. And traveling through the spirit world. So for me and my work in terms of travel and photography, I've always gravitated towards them. Because I see them as quite a protective force around me and the various journeys that I would take. But they're probably two different expressions of the same thing. Just as we have Hermes and Mercury being kind of almost like for like, Saint Christopher is an extension of that, I believe. It's a very similar character. Although the history, because there's a couple of things with this. The way you have, like, for example, you've got the amalgamation of Hermes and Anubis. Hermanubis, the dog-headed version. So Saint Christopher in Orthodox Christianity is often depicted as having a dog head. So there's just so many kind of synergies to that figure that there seems to be kind of whatever that archetype is, it's another expression of it. One's a saint, one's a god. You know,
Having not grown up Catholic myself, I had some idea they preserved a lot of ancient sort of customs, perhaps, but I didn't know just how much.
oh, there's loads of it. I mean, there's absolutely loads of it. Like in St. Martin's Day, which it's just after Halloween. St. Martin's Day, it's not that long ago. People would do a blood sacrifice on the threshold. You know, often some poor chicken would get it on the in the farm, and their blood would be spilled for Martin. So for Saint Martin. So you know, it's like animal sacrifice, blood sacrifice. That is not seen as a Christian thing. It is 100% featuring in folk Christian belief. You know, and it's in living memory that used to be a very, very common thing in Ireland.
Absolutely. I was digging through your Instagram, just looking at different pictures that you shared because I thought I'm going to pick one out of here and ask you about it. I like to watch Hot Ones. You ever watch that show? Guy that makes people
yeah,
it's
pretty good. Yeah,
and he always does that. He's like, explain that, Graham. I thought, why not do this with a guy who's a photographer? And of all the pictures that caught my attention the most for this, of course, is one that features books in the background, and I see really good ones here. You've got Liber Null, Prime Chaos, Chaos Protocols, Protection Reverse of Magic, like all very, very good books. But what is interesting in the picture is a picture of a golden, I guess a bronze or a golden peacock.
Yes.
And it says, is it Melek Taus?
Melek Taus.
Is that right? Yeah, the peacock angel, the first king of the earth. So explain that one. There's a story here.
So Melek Taus is the god of the Yazidis. So you may have heard of the Yazidis as being essentially massacred and genocided by ISIS when they took over Iraq. So they're seen as devil worshippers, and to that point, that's why what happened to them happened to them. So they worship a deity called Melek Taus, who is the angel who was put in charge of the earth by God. But it's kind of associated with kind of a Luciferian figure, in that it's the kind of the spirit that rules this domain, the angel that is was assigned to be the first king of the earth, or the king of the earth. You'll often see peacock feathers on witches' altars, and that's what that's about. It's a reference to kind of a Luciferian figure through Melek Taus, in that the ruler of the earth. So it's petitioning the ruler of the earth to intercede on your behalf.
Very cool. Yeah, I thought there'd be a good story behind that one. Yeah, it's funny. You say the Yazidis were thought to be devil worshippers.
Yeah.
I'm not really familiar with the Yazidis beyond the name is familiar to me, because as a teenager, I got interested in everything I could get my hands on. One of those was Anton LaVey's writing,
right.
The Satanic Bible, the Satanic Witch, the Devil's Notebook. I think it was in the Devil's Notebook that he talks about the Yazidis as like fellow Satanists of some sort. Yeah, so that's where I heard about them. Let's see here. Darragh, have you yourself ever experienced a haunting of any kind?
Yeah. Yes, I have. Yeah. I mean, I lived in a haunted house for a while. Now, I never saw anything, but my brother did. My dad always sees stuff. He's like the seventh son of a seventh child of a seventh child. So within kind of Irish folklore, that has a kind of gifts associated to it. Whether he would call them gifts, I don't think so. I think he's kind of right. But yeah, we lived in a place in Mayo for a while where turned out there was two twins living there in like the 50s or 60s, but one of them died of TB. And we kind of ascertained that it was the one that died of TB that was kind of hanging around. As I said, I never saw anything, but I walked into a room and I was just like instantly, okay, let's get out of here. There's just like really kind of get that, like the hair just goes bump up on the back of your neck, and you don't really need to think about anything. You're like just immediately slamming it in reverse and getting the hell out of there. And so that was kind of a more of a sensory thing. I never had a visual interaction. I never had something that was focused with its attention on me or anything like that. I didn't have that. What I got was just that sense of like, this isn't good, don't like this. And there's that kind of integral discomfort that a living being has when it experiences something that isn't living. That always has attention to it. Now, when I did see something, was many years later in London, in a flat in Clapham in London. Now, that area in South London was really very heavily bombed during World War II, as the German bombers would be going over central London. They'd often dump. That would be in their bomb paths to get to key areas, and so like there was a huge amount of violence and death there. But not to mention it's London. London is a global city. It's an eternal city. So people have been living there for 1,000 years, and has a huge amount of history on it. But I was in my flat and I just kind of getting into bed, and I saw a like a 2.5 foot bluish cloud just float across the middle of my room with little sparks in it. And it was one of those ones where, I kind of, sorry, I'm laughing when I think about it, because I remember my thought process at the time was just kind of like, okay, I'm going to look away. And then if I'm going to look back and it'll be gone, I look back and I'm like, okay, it's still there. Oh, Jesus. You're kind of just having that kind of like bottled freak out, like not making a sound, but at the inside, it's just going, God,
Yeah.
what the hell's happening?
That's a 5-year-old strategy to deal with a ghost.
Yeah, 100% is. Yeah, very much.
You can't see me. I can't see you.
Exactly. I'm still of the school of thought of, if your foot's outside your bed, something can grab it. That they get it under the duvet where it's safe. But my flatmate, he got a ban. He was actually, he was seeing things. Like he was, I came home one time from work and he was like, did you open the window in your room? And I'm like, no. He said, because the door of your room just slammed shut. And he was like, I'm really glad you're home. Really freaked out. There's just something's not right. And to the point where we had kind of some poltergeist activity, like where all the doors opened in the kitchen and like plates stacked in the middle of the floor. I never got to the bottom of it. I just moved out, to be honest. I took a very practical approach. I was like, okay, well, enjoy the flat. I'm moving out. That was it.
Now, in all your travels,
Yeah.
dealing with the Aghori and searching for the Djinn, researching fairy lore and everything else, have you come up with some strategy or influence of what you might do about a haunting now?
I mean, just basic stuff, in terms of like doing clearings and using smells that like spirits don't like, burning them on charcoal bricks and that kind of thing. But I'm always very kind of clear to point out to people that I might be able to kind of point them in the right direction, but I'm not. I'm not an exorcist. I don't deal with that territory.
Know your place, I guess, right?
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, you call the exorcist, I'll come over and take the pictures.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I'm very much a kind of a stay in my lane type.
Yeah.
When it comes to kind of like that kind of hands-on approach. But like I said, it's when you're kind of in that territory and when you're describing the landscape, people come and ask you to guide them through. that's ultimately what happens, and that's the kind of the messages I get, and often I can point people in the right direction, and sometimes that right direction isn't a spiritual one at all, so it's much of a muchness, it the whole thing of the travel. I mean, I always had that in me. I always kind of had that kind of oh, I really want to know. I want to see. I want to understand. That's why I do what I do. I want to know. I just have that in me, and I always have done. That I've always found the original description of our world, that kind of the empirical view of the world, just never satisfying. It never kind of went. That was never enough. It never felt enough. Yeah. And that's where kind of all my exploration started. But even with seeing what I thought was like a weird kind of self-illuminating cloud drift to my room, it's just a weird experience. It's not really kind of an affirming thing. You can put that down to anything really. Like you look back, it's 15 years ago. Did I dream it? I don't think so. But it starts to become a little bit foggy and hard to really discern total clarity of memories. So that's why I started to do a lot of the photographic work that I did. My camera gave me entry into places that I couldn't normally get to. That's why I went to photograph those subjects. So I ultimately wanted to know about them, but the camera did give me access, and that became a very life-changing piece for me, because when I did start exploring, I did have the intention of going to photograph the Djinn, or sites related to the Djinn from a specific book about Delhi called City of Djinns. Once I kind of booked my flights and was kind of doing my research, lined up my photographic agency to have me a fixer on the other side, to take me through the areas I needed to get just little thing after little thing started to go wrong. And it was nothing massively dramatic, but quite significant. And when I look back, it was enough to make, before I went, for me to go, someone doesn't want me to come. And you probably heard me say it on the Rune Soup podcast, where I think I've pissed off the Djinn, and it was that things like my camera broke. And like when I say my camera broke, it normally, before you go on a big trip like that, you go and get your camera service. So they give the sensor a clean, check everything's working on it, and then make sure all my glass is spotless, all that kind of stuff. So I had some dirt in my sensor. I brought it in for a pro clean, and they're like, "We can't clean this. We've done everything we can. We can't get it clean. I've never seen anything like it." I take it to the place where like the engineers who work for the photographic companies take their cameras to get cleaned. And they came back going, "There's no way we can clean this. Whatever it is, it's you'll have to replace the internal body. So you'll have to take out the box where the sensor sits, the whole thing, and put a new one in." And it was one of those ones. It was just so ineffective to replace it that I ended up just having to buy a second-hand camera off a photographer friend. But same thing, I couldn't find the warranty for it. It was less than a year old. And that's the kind of stuff where I'm really diligent. So just things like that just went wrong. In the airport, my dad came with me. He wanted to kind of see a bit of India. He came with me. His tooth broke in Heathrow Airport as we're waiting to leave. Yikes. So, our hotel, well, we couldn't get to our hotel when we arrived. We had to show up in another hotel, and we had to move the hotel like 3 times in 2 days. And it was just a disaster. It was just like, it wasn't a disaster. It was just really challenging, and the whole raft of issues. And so it didn't take very long for me to go, and I forgot to mention one key thing. I had a dream before I went about 2 weeks ago. It was quite a nightmarish one, where I had a figure. I was at a Sufi religious celebration, and a figure turned to me with kind of a turban on, with one snake, a snake going in one eye and coming out the other, with a skeletal face going, "Don't come here," and that obviously got straight to the point. And and I woke up and I was like, "Oh Christ," because obviously I want to go, but that was quite full on. But I still wasn't, kind of. I was freaked out by it, but I wasn't kind of, right, that's a definite no. And it was interesting as well, like kind of when I was talking to that experience with Gordon White. He mentioned, well, you probably would have went anyway, wouldn't you? And actually, when I look back at it, yeah, he's right. I would have gone anyway, because that's the point, of the photographic work. That's why you do that stuff, because it isn't easy, because it's hard. I may retrospectively, I probably would have been a little bit more cautious, or maybe done a lot more work in protecting myself, or certainly trying to make it abundantly clear that my goal was to, document fairly and not to portray something incorrectly.
Yeah. And I think, when I teach in my own tradition, cleansing and knowing how to ward and protect yourself, of course, very important, but also how to make allies and get into right relationship with spirit. And, like Gordon said, you would have gone anyway, and you agree, you would have gone anyway. But when you describe these challenges you have to go through, it's almost like you're being given these ordeals of a sort of initiation. They're saying, if you're going to enter our world, let's see if you'll climb this wall and overcome that challenge, and then really try to scare the shit out of you. And if you walk through that fear, we'll open our mysteries to you.
Yeah. I think that's I think that's a very insightful view of it. Because it has changed things for me. Because as I've kind of delved into it and explored it more and become better read, I have ended up in a far more esoteric world. It's far more embedded in my life. As being kind of a something that would have been in the background, it's far more in the foreground now. And the company I keep has changed. It's been a far more magical company, which has been great. Ultimately, it's improved my life. I don't talk about the Djinn in any way disrespectful way at all. Not at all. I'm very mindful. It's just like the whole like the Irish thing, where I must say it's a British thing as well, but where people talk about fairies, they call them kind of like the good people, the other crowd. Like it's always a kind of deferential term that people use. The exact same thing in Islam. They call the Djinn the same thing, kind of like the kind people. That kind of stuff exists, and I think that's it. I think you can kind of build a relationship where you be courteous and get courtesy back. Saying that, my kind of, as I mentioned earlier, kind of my Muslim friends who know that I'm kind of explore this territory are very much, if you take an interest in the Djinn, they'll take an interest in you. But, people always say that. Like it's the same thing around demonology and spirits, and there possibly is some truth to it. The whole point of a lot of magical stuff is to do exactly that.
Yeah, I tell people it's like the mafia. Once you're a made man, you're a made. It's it. Try to walk away, they won't let you.
You're in for life.
That's right. So buckle up. You might as well learn some stuff.
Yeah.
You were talking about. You've been to a lot of pretty interesting places and well off the beaten path at times, I'm sure. But just thinking back on places you've lived or places you've traveled, what's some bit of local folklore or architecture or like legend or some kind that really stands out as one of your favorite?
Ooh, that's a good question. Um, there's a few places that are really interesting. One of them really kind of stands to memory is a place in Delhi called Feroz Shah Kulta, and it's like because Delhi is made up of like five cities, kind of one fell, another one rose, and Feroz Shah Kulta is I think it's the fifth century emperor, something like that, if I remember correctly, and it's an old citadel. And it's kind of a pyramidal structure with a lot of arches in the bottom and kind of grottos underneath it. And it's got a pillar of Ashkatan on the top. So when you look at the Indian flag, you'll see kind of a wheel on it, like a chakra, and that I think that represents the wheel of Dharma. So there's a bunch of these pillars all over India, and there's since some of them been kind of destroyed by the Mughals when they kind of invaded. But that's a hugely symbolic. The Ashkatan pillars are they're like as Indian as it gets. So one of the symbols from one of those pillars is on the flag, and then there's another one that sits on that wheel of three lions standing back to back, and that's on the front of their passport. So the Indian kind of symbols of the state of India are from these pillars, and there's one on top of Feroz Shah Kulta, and that's said to be inhabited by a Djinn called Lat Walia Baba, and he's kind of the chief Djinn of the area. This place is supposed to be the most haunted place in Delhi with 10,000 Djinn there. And I went there, my fixer, to photograph the site, and all around it there was like letters left there to the Djinn, and people were doing different kind of like kind of the stations of the different grottos, going from each grotto to each grotto and repeating their prayers and petitions, writing letters, leaving sweets, leaving bread and milk, and oil lanterns there to the Djinn. And so when I approached the place with my fixer, who's a young Kashmiri photographer, really talented guy, who very kindly took me around to those specific sites and did the interpreting for me. We were chatting to the main it was a cop and kind of a cashier at the front of it, and there's always kind of a fee for tourists, like non-Indian tourists. There's always a fee for non-Indian tourists. So the lady there with a little kind of money tin, and I was paying my fee, giving them the ticket, and uh, my fixer was going, so can we find the area that's associated with the Djinn? And the security guard and the lady running the place, they wouldn't tell me. They just kind of awkwardly pretended they didn't hear me and just kind of did kind of yeah, just like ignoring us. They just wouldn't tell us. Like, no, sorry. Got a bit closer, and there's like a bungalow in the park grounds. Asked the guy there. He's like, yeah, sorry, don't know what you mean. And then we figured out where it was, and it's literally you could see it from where they were. They just were like, no, I'm not telling you. They just wouldn't let kind of like, I don't want a foreigner going up looking for the Djinn, cameras hanging off, and they're like, no, I don't want any of this. Not happening. I'm not kind of transgressing here. And we went to the site, and there was a family going around the grottos, and there was a precocious young girl family who apparently was giving me a bit of a slagging in Hindi. My fixer was telling me, Shams was telling me, yeah, she's slagging off your beard. I was like, very, very nice for her, but anyway, like her father, I got chatting to him afterwards and kind of saying, what are you doing? She's like, well, we're petitioning the Djinns here to help us, to bring kind of good fortune to the family. And we're doing a kind of a 2 weekly ritual where kind of every day there's the circuit of the different grottos. And I was like, well, is it working? And he was like, yeah, we're halfway through. It's already working. So it's a living thing. There's a living tradition there. But the interesting thing is the earliest record of association of Djinn and the site is like the 1970s. So
Oh,
it's
no
not
kidding.
going back hundreds of years. It's like going back to like 1974, something like that. So it's always, and India always has that thing. That's what really that's the one thing I love about that place, because it has a vast amount of history and hugely symbolic history, and then it's got all this mystery, like 10,000 Djinns live here, and like, but apparently they only moved there in 1974. It's
Who
always that.
decided?
Yeah, exactly. There's just always that level of kind of wonderful kind of just absurdity and kind of totally out of left field elements to the stories there, and that was a hugely interesting place. But certainly other sites that kind of I've been to. I mean, Göbekli Tepe is an incredible experience. The ruins of Haran, another amazing place. They're places that will stay with me for a long time. And of course, like Haran is the location where what we call the Picatrix was originally written.
Yeah.
Which is which is the huge has a huge presence in Western magic. It's massive. It's up there with the Corpus Hermeticum. It is significantly influenced Western esotericism. It's where a huge amount of our kind of astrological magic comes from.
That is true. Yeah. And for folks who are using astrological magic, that would be a interesting pilgrimage, I think, probably to take, just to experience the place where these things arose into human consciousness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And then
So, I guess at this point, I'm going to have to bring you back, because you're one of the most interesting people I've ever spoken to, and that's just a simple fact. But we're getting towards the end of the usual broadcast here. Is there something that I should have asked, or something you'd like to talk about that I didn't cover, or if you have any parting thoughts that you want to share with everyone, here'd be a good place to bring any of that up.
Okay. I would say that if somebody's interested in the idea or mythos around the Djinn, is to look locally as well, because that's the thing that really changed for me, is that I went off to all these different places and different cultures and experienced them, and took a lot from them in terms of how it changed me. But when I got home, I started looking at kind of Irish lore, Irish fairy lore, and really kind of delving into that a lot more, and started to see just unbelievable synergies. I don't think it's a like for like thing. I don't think it's that simple. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, wherever you go, somehow it takes you home, and it takes you home with new eyes, and that's the best thing about traveling. And in these times where we're kind of all locked down, all I can say is, when it lifts, if you've got the chance to travel, go. It's a wonderful thing. I will check.
Yeah, you're the second person today to tell me that.
Synergy.
Yeah, I'm going to need more sponsors.
You heard the man. Come on, get on it.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for taking the time to be here today, and I really hope that everyone listening has gotten as much enjoyment out of this as I have. Where can people find you in your work?
So I'm on YouTube. Just look at Google Darragh Mason Field. You'll find me on YouTube. I've got my own podcast called Spirit Box. Yeah, you'll have to come on, Lonnie. We'll have to.
Oh, I'm game.
Awesome. And then Twitter and Instagram. So yeah, not Facebook. Don't bother. I'm not on Facebook.
And I'll make sure that all those links are up in the show notes for everybody to find. That way you don't have to worry about going searching and so on. Thank you so much again for taking the time to be here. This was incredibly fun. For everyone listening, thank you for tuning in. If you want to hear the rest of this conversation, where we get a little bit weirder as usual, you're going to have to go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio and give me that high five to get in the club. So, as always, seek those mysteries and stay weird out there, my friends. And it is bonus audio time. Are you ready?
I am.
All right. Well, Darragh, people say that, and as always, they're not. No. The first question that goes around this place is always, what famous person's resting place do you most want to visit?
Ooh, that's really interesting.
Do you want to hear how they just answered that question? What famous person's resting place would you most like to visit? That and many others, including what they think about the afterlife, what they may or may not do in cemeteries, what are their traditions, magical practices that have to do with the dead, folklore that surrounds their homes, and so much more, available for only $5. $5 a month. Even if I make more than one episode in a month, it's still just $5 a month at patreon.com/weirdwebradio, or go to weirdwebradio.com and click join the membership. You can find me on Instagram at weirdwebradio. You can find me on Facebook as Weird Web Radio, or come join the new, fun, and exciting Weird Web Radio Facebook group. Thank you again for being here. Stay weird out there, my friends.